Next question is from Riv Rivera on YouTube. Adam, how about that residual sweetness in hazies? How do they do that? I've heard they use maltodextrin. Others use lactose. I don't want to use either. I agree with you. Is there something different? First of all, let's dip in on this. There are a few ways to approach residual sweetness in beers. One is an actual higher finishing gravity. So having more residual sweetness in the beer. Okay. So actually doing exactly what we're talking about doing. Sometimes you can do that with crystal malt. But the problem is with hazy, with crystal malt, unless you're going really, really pale, and those crystal malts will push up the residual sweetness, you can start building color in those and maybe start getting a little bit of a weird color out of them because those hazy beers, I don't know, they can get a little wonky looking in a hurry if you're too dark on the SRM on the color scale with them. I would encourage you to really look at pushing up your mash temperature. Now, there's some areas where people get nervous. Higher mash temp will push you further into the alpha amylase enzyme range for that mash, and it will definitely create longer chain sugars that will not be readily fermented by your standard beer yeast, and they can add sweetness as well. Sometimes we get nervous in the high 150 Fs, close to 70 C, because we're like, oh, we're going to denature all of our enzyme. And that can be true. The further you go up that temperature range for them, you can start knocking them out. And I've really had a hard time. I've gone up to like 156 and I was kind of sticking there, and I'm like, man, I'm really not pushing up my finishing gravity on some of these hazies. And then I'm like, you know what? I'm going for it. I'm going and then the one time I just slammed it up to 159 or 70-ish C. And all of a sudden I got a much bigger residual sweetness on the backside, and it was much rounder. And I felt like it was a really big step forward in the juiciness. So dig this. If you pull up your chart that shows the range of both where alpha amylase and beta amylase enzymes are cleaving starches into sugar, when you go further up on the warmer side of it, those I'm sorry, my brain's being a little weird right now. Sometimes you can get scared when you start getting into that high 150s into the close 70 C. But here's the deal: at 158 F or 70 C, you're still getting 100% of your alpha amylase rocking and doing its thing. You can push higher. If you go up to 162 F or 72 C, you still have, you're still rocking at 80% of what that alpha amylase can be doing. If you want to be slow with your ramp up on this, that's fine. I get being nervous about wanting to go too high and feeling like you're going to denature all your enzymes. But I'll tell you, that was one of the big boosts for me, is when I really pushed that mash temperature up, and I got that finishing gravity up, and I feel like it really, really helped. A couple other nuts and bolts things that you could also be doing. You can also be dropping bitterness levels. But I have a feeling your beers probably aren't too bitter when you're doing hazy. And you can also try to influence the perception of that, which you can, of course, do through heavy use of chloride, which is pretty typical, standard for the style, or a flaked adjunct, whether that be flaked oats or flaked rye. You can really try to stack up your intense fruit flavors, because remember, when you are stacking up really intense flavors and aromas that imply sweetness, sometimes it can actually translate into your perception of sweetness on that beer. But let's get into the sugar maltodextrin thing that you were talking about. Some people do use lactose in them, and they obviously list it. I know Scott Janish has used maltodextrin in some of his, and he'll even add them like post ferment cold side, if I'm remembering correctly. And I'm sure that's like boiling, boiling that in water, cooling it down, degassing it, whatever, and then pushing it into a tank and mixing it. Me personally, I've never had a ton of success with maltodextrin in that way. And maybe I need to fuss with it more. I used to do like a kind of a hazy pale back at Cartridge, and I would try to be pretty aggressive with the bitterness, but I still wanted the body. I didn't want trying to balance that, firmly bitter beer, but a beer that's also dry and not having it get too much. And so there was times where I played with some maltodextrin in that recipe, and it would bump my final gravity up, 5 to 6 points, or 1 to 1.5 Plato. But I would see the number, but I still didn't see it in the beer. I didn't perceive it in the beer. It could be me. Maybe I needed to go bigger after it. But I get not wanting to use sugar. But Riv, my guess is really start pushing the upper range of your mash range, or your comfortability with that, and see where that gets you. And hopefully you start seeing what you want out of that finished beer. Cheers, man.